The war didn't start with humans. It started when one god betrayed the others. Sumerian tablets record an extermination order, cities marked for erasure, and weapons that scarred the sky itself. Then the record stops mid-sentence. What happened that even the gods couldn't finish writing? The University of Pennsylvania Museum houses approximately 40,000 tablets excavated from Nippur between 1889 and 1900. Most were photographed decades ago, cataloged by surface content and stored. In 2004, a doctoral researcher reviewing photographed materials noticed something unusual about texts classified as miscellaneous lamentations. Fragments that reference not natural disaster or enemy invasion, but divine abandonment preceding destruction. One tablet excavated from the temple district and dated to approximately 1900 BC contains 16 lines describing the departure of Enlil from Nippur. The text is matter of fact. It doesn't frame the event as punishment or metaphor. It states that the god left his temple, traveled north to the mountains, and refused to return despite appeals from the city's human administrators. 3 lines later, the tablet describes fire falling from the sky and an evil wind that rendered the land barren. The fragment itself is unremarkable. Reddish clay roughly the size of an adult hand with cuneiform pressed deep enough to remain legible after 4,000 years. But its content align with dozens of similar texts scattered across collections worldwide. The Lament for Ur describes the same sequence. The Lament for Suma and describes the same sequence. The Eridu Lament describes the same sequence. Gods leaving temples. Destruction following their departure. Land that cannot recover. These aren't isolated compositions. When arranged chronologically and geographically, they form a coherent pattern, a cascade of institutional collapse that ended Sumerian civilization as a functioning political system. The texts themselves offer no external enemy, no natural explanation sufficient to account for the scale of devastation. Instead, they insist the destruction was authorized by divine counsel, executed deliberately, and final. This raises a question mainstream scholarship addresses by framing the texts as mythological responses to historical trauma, poetry created to process the incomprehensible. But the tablets don't read like poetry struggling to explain chaos. They read like administrative records documenting a political breakdown the scribes witnessed directly. If you're following this investigation, whether you're listening at home, during a commute, or in the quiet hours when sleep won't come, understand that what follows relies entirely on attested texts. No speculation beyond what the sources themselves preserve. No modern frameworks imposed on ancient records, just the tablets arranged in sequence describing something they never explicitly named but recorded in methodical detail across generations. We'll examine what the texts actually say. We'll trace the pattern from its earliest references through to the final catastrophe, and we'll ask whether the Sumerians were mythologizing their collapse or documenting how divine rule ended when the system governing it fractured beyond repair. But to understand what these tablets describe, we first need to establish who the Anunnaki were said to be, why the Sumerians believed they ruled directly, and what archaeological evidence confirms about the cities they supposedly governed. The British Museum's Department of the Middle East holds storage beyond what most visitors see. Climate-controlled rooms, metal shelving extending floor to ceiling, boxes containing fragments never fully translated, only catalogued by excavation site and approximate date. The Aeschylean Museum at Oxford maintains similar reserves. So does the Oriental Institute in Chicago. Combined, these institutions house tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets that have been photographed once, described briefly, and shelved. Many were excavated over a century ago. Kunik, Nippur, Geru, dug from temple complexes and administrative buildings, then shipped in crates to European and American collections. The initial cataloging focused on identifying known literary works. Anything that didn't match established compositions was labeled fragment unidentified or votive administrative. But photography technology has improved. Digital archives now allow researchers to examine surface details invisible to 19th century archaeologists working by lamplight in the field. In recent decades, scattered anomalies have surfaced. A tablet from references the years when the gods made war upon their own council. Another from Lagash describes 7 cities that burned in one season, though no enemy approached. A fragment housed in Philadelphia mentions land that would not accept seed for 3 generations after the fire came from above. These are not poetic exaggerations. The texts use the same administrative language found in grain receipts and land surveys. They are dated most as copies made in the 18th or 17th century BC, transcribing material the scribes explicitly identify as far older. They reference events before the language itself changed, before Akkadian replaced Sumerian in daily use. When you line them up chronologically, geographically, thematically, they stop appearing random. They describe a sequence, disputes within divine councils, territorial violations, decisions that escalate, cities abandoned by their patron gods, and then around 2000 BC, coordinated collapse. Were these myths invented to explain trauma or records of what happened when a political system divine in nature destroyed itself? To answer that, we first need to understand who the Anunnaki was said to be and why the Sumerians insisted they once ruled the world directly. Southern Mesopotamia is flat, marshy, and floods seasonally. It has no stone for building, no timber for construction, no metal deposits. By every geographic measure, it should not have been the birthplace of urban civilization. Yet around 4000 BC, villages became cities with monumental architecture, irrigation networks, and administrative bureaucracies that required thousands of laborers working in coordinated systems. Eridu's temple precinct shows 17 successive rebuilding phases, each constructed directly atop the previous foundation. Continuous ritual importance spanning 3,000 years. Uruk reached a population of 50,000 by 3200 BC. Surrounded by 6 miles of defensive walls, Nippur became the religious center where divine councils were said to convene. These are not legends. Excavation confirms dates, construction layers, and the sudden emergence of complexity where subsistence farming had existed generations before. The Sumerian king list provides the chronological framework reconstructed from multiple tablet copies, the most complete held at Oxford's Ashmolean Museum. It opens with a phrase translated plainly. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. It then names 8 kings ruling 5 cities before the flood. Their reigns are measured in sars. 1 sar equals 3,600 years. Alulim of Eridu ruled 28 for 800 years. Algar ruled 36,000 years. The document offers no mythic framing, no allegory. It lists these figures in the same administrative style used for grain inventories. After the flood entry, the flood swept over, the list resumes. Post-flood kings ruled shorter spans, still extraordinary, 400 years, 300 years, but nothing approaching the pre-flood lengths. The text provides no explanation for the change. It simply records both eras using identical bureaucratic language. The word Anunnaki appears throughout temple records not as abstract deities, but as governors. Enki administered Eridu. Enlil controlled Nippur. Nana governed Ur. Inanna held Uruk. Each city maintained a household for its patron requiring workers, offerings, and service. The texts don't describe worship. They describe administration. If these beings ruled directly, maintaining order through physical presence and jurisdictional authority, what crisis emerged severe enough to require the creation of an entirely new labor force? humanity itself. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC, but describing far earlier events, opens with a problem rarely discussed in mythological contexts: labor distribution before humanity existed. The text explains the Anunnaki divided responsibilities. The senior gods, Anu, Enlil, Enki, held authority. A second tier, the Igigi, performed the physical work, digging canals, dredging riverbeds, maintaining irrigation systems across southern Mesopotamia. The text records this arrangement lasting 40 years. Then it states plainly, the labor was heavy, the distress too much. The Igigi stopped working. They burned their tools. They marched to Enlil's temple in Nippur and surrounded it at night, refusing to resume their duties. This wasn't rebellion framed as cosmic allegory. The epic describes a labor strike organized, deliberate, and effective enough to force the senior gods into emergency council. Enlil's initial response was to suppress the revolt by force. Anu advised negotiation. Enki proposed a third option: create a substitute workforce. The solution required divine essence, blood from a slain god mixed with clay to produce beings capable of labor but not divine authority. Humanity's creation was logistical. The text uses the Sumerian word lulu, often translated as man, but more precisely meaning worker or mixed one. The epic describes implementation in procedural detail. Enki oversaw the design. The birth goddess Ninu shaped the first specimens. 7 males, 7 females created to relieve the Igigi of their burden. The experiment succeeded. Humans reproduced independently, required no direct divine maintenance, and performed the necessary labor without complaint. For a time. Atrahasis continues, humans multiplied beyond initial projections. The text describes population growth in terms that sound biological, not mythic. Generations spreading across the land, settlements expanding along waterways, noise levels increasing. Then comes a line scholars often interpret as metaphor. The land bellowed like a bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their clamor and said to the great gods, "The clamor of mankind has become burdensome to me. I am losing sleep because of their noise." 3 times the text records, Enlil attempted population control through plague, drought, and famine. Each time, Enki intervened, instructing humans how to survive, preserve seed, and recover. The solution designed to resolve one crisis had generated another. Humanity would not self-limit. The Igigi would not resume their labor, and the senior gods could not agree on how to restore order. When a political system cannot resolve internal disputes through existing mechanisms, it resorts to final measures. How did the Anunnaki attempt to reset the system entirely? And what did that decision reveal about the fractures already forming within their authority? The flood appears in 3 primary Mesopotamian sources: the Eridu Genesis, the oldest Sumerian account, the Atrahasis epic, and the later Babylonian Gilgamesh cycle. All 3 describe the same event, but the earliest version, Eridu Genesis, fragmentary and damaged, contains details. The later adaptations soften or omit entirely. In Atrahasis, Enlil convenes the divine council and proposes a final solution to the population crisis: total extermination through flood. The text records formal agreement. Anu supports the measure. The assembly consents. Instructions are issued to unleash waters from above and below simultaneously, ensuring no geographic refuge. The decision is framed not as moral judgment, but as administrative necessity. Humanity had become unmanageable, and the system required reset. But the text immediately complicates this unity. Enki, bound by oath not to warn humanity, directly circumvents the restriction. He speaks to the wall of a house where Atrahasis, a human administrator in his service, sleeps inside. Wall. Listen to me, Enki says, describing the coming flood in precise detail. How to build a vessel, what dimensions to use, which materials will survive, how long the waters will last. The text does not present this as compassion. It presents it as calculated defiance. Atrahasis survives, his family survives, the animals he brings aboard survive. When the waters recede and he offers sacrifice, the gods starving, the text says, because human labor has ceased and no offerings have been made, gather like flies around the altar. Enlil arrives, sees the smoke, and realizes immediately what has occurred. Someone violated the decree. The confrontation that follows is not framed as divine drama. Enlil accuses Enki directly. Enki does not deny the act. He justifies it on procedural grounds. Humanity's extermination was premature, disproportionate, and ignored alternative measures. The council, the text implies, fractured at that moment, not over humanity's value, but over whether the decision had been executed without proper deliberation. The flood succeeded in reducing human population, but it failed in its primary objective, restoring unified divine governance. The Sumerian king list marks the flood as a civilizational boundary. Everything divides into before and after. Post-flood cities rebuild. Kingship resumes. But the text never again described the Anunnaki acting with singular authority. Trust once broken within a governing system does not restore itself through treaty or time. It furs. And when authority is contested, power must be secured through other means. If the flood could not restore order, how did the Anunnaki attempt to reassert control? And what object became the symbol of that struggle? Across multiple Mesopotamian texts, Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian, one object appears repeatedly as the mechanism of supreme authority, the Tablet of Destinies. It is not described symbolically. The texts treat it as a physical artifact whose possession confers the ability to issue binding decrees, control cosmic forces, and legitimize rulership. Whoever holds the tablet commands the assembly. Whoever loses it loses authority immediately. The tablet is kept according to the earliest references in Enlil's sanctuary at Nippur. But the Anzu epic, preserved in multiple versions spanning over 1,000 years, describes its theft. Anzu, a minor deity or divine servant, depending on the text, steals the tablet while Enlil bathes. The moment possession changes hands, the text says, the divine regulations cease to function, silence spread. All rituals were suspended. The theft triggers immediate political collapse. Anu convenes an emergency council. Multiple gods refuse the mission to retrieve it. Adad declines. Jira declines. Shara declines. Because confronting the holder of the tablet means confronting absolute authority, even if that authority was seized unlawfully. Eventually, Ninurta accepts the task. He recovers the tablet by force. Order resumes. But the text records the event without framing it as anomaly. It happened, it could happen again, and it does. Later compositions describe other seizures, sometimes through theft, sometimes through combat, sometimes through unclear means. Each time the tablet changes hands, the same pattern follows. Cosmic mechanisms halt, divine authority becomes uncertain, and violence is required to restore the previous order. The system, in other words, proves itself vulnerable to whoever holds a single object. This is not mythological allegory. This is documentation of a political structure dependent on physical possession of a legitimizing artifact, an arrangement that guarantees instability whenever succession is disputed or authority is contested. The texts describe exactly what occurs in any system where power derives not from consensus, but from control of a symbol. Repeated coups, temporary restorations, and escalating distrust. By the time Sumerian cities reach their height in the 3rd millennium BC, divine rule is no longer described as unified governance. It is described as territorial gods governing specific cities with specific jurisdictions bound by specific limitations. Crossing those boundaries, even for other gods, carries consequences. The texts treat as absolute, and when those boundaries are crossed, not by theft or rebellion, but by direct confrontation between ruling authorities, the violence is no longer political. It becomes existential. What happened when gods violated each other's domains? And what did those violations reveal about how fragile divine law had become? In Anna's Descent to the Underworld, preserved in Sumerian on tablets from the early 2nd millennium BC, describes something scholars often interpret as fertility myth or seasonal allegory. But when read as jurisdictional record, it describes the execution of a ruling deity by another ruling deity within her own sovereign territory and the political crisis that follows. Inanna, goddess of Uruk, descends to the underworld, the domain of her sister, Arshigal. The text is precise about protocol. Inanna cannot simply enter. She approaches 7 gates. At each gate, she is stripped of one item: her crown, her lapis necklace, her breastplate, her ring, her measuring rod, her garments. By the time she reaches the throne room, she has been reduced from ruling authority to supplicant. Arshigal does not negotiate. The text states plainly, the Anunnaki, the 7 judges, pronounce judgment before her.
They looked at Inanna. It was the look of death. They spoke to her. It was the speech of anger. They shouted at her. It was the shout of heavy guilt. The afflicted woman was turned into a corpse, and the corpse was hung on a hook. Inanna dies not metaphorically, not temporarily in the sense of sleep or trance. The text uses the word for corpse adder and describes decomposition beginning. 3 days and 3 nights pass. Her minister, following prior instructions, appeals to the senior gods for intervention. Enki responds by creating 2 beings to retrieve her body. They descend, recover the corpse, and apply the water of life and the food of life. Inanna revives, but the underworld does not release anyone without replacement. She must provide a substitute. The text does not frame this as myth. It describes a legal proceeding, an execution, and a resurrection achieved only through external intervention that required violating Areshigal's jurisdiction. The story establishes several things simultaneously. Divine authority within a territory is absolute even against other gods. Divine law permits lethal enforcement, and restoring life requires powers beyond what individual gods possess independently. This is not the only account of divine violence. The Era epic describes a god who nearly destroys Babylon through uncontrolled rage. Texts from Mari reference conflicts between territorial deities resulting in the destruction of sanctuaries. The pattern repeats when divine jurisdiction is violated, or when disputes cannot be resolved through counsel. The texts describe force, immediate, absolute, and often catastrophic. If gods could kill gods within their own realms, and if authority had fragmented into competing territories with incompatible laws, what protection did human cities possess when conflict escalated beyond diplomatic resolution? Around 2000 BC, a genre of Sumerian literature emerges that has no earlier precedent. Lamentation texts. These are not hymns. They are not prayers for favor or requests for intervention. They are formal records of abandonment composed after catastrophe, describing in procedural detail how gods physically departed their temples and what followed in their absence. The lament for Ur, preserved on tablets from Nippur, and Ur itself opens with a statement that historians often read as poetic metaphor. The god has abandoned his chamber, has gone from his city. But the text does not turn this departure symbolically. It describes Nanna, patron god of air, leaving his sanctuary, traveling north toward the mountains and refusing to return despite appeals from priests and city administrators. The language is administrative, not emotional. He left. He did not come back. The lament for Suma and Ur expands this pattern across multiple cities. Enlil abandons Nippur. Enki withdraws from Eridu. Inanna departs Uruk. Ninurta leaves Girsu. Each departure follows the same sequence. Divine council decrees destruction. Patron gods exit their sanctuaries and human populations are left without protection. The texts emphasize that this was not military defeat. The gods were not driven out. They chose to leave. What follows their departure is described in language that resists easy interpretation. The texts reference the storm, the evil wind, and the word of an Enlil that destroys the land. Cities fall silent. Livestock die. Crops fail across regions that had sustained agriculture for millennia. The lament for describes bodies piling in the streets, survivors fleeing into the marshes, and silence replacing the sounds of daily life, markets, festivals, ritual songs that are defined urban existence. But the most unsettling detail appears in repeated refrains. The storm ordered by An. The storm ordered by Enlil. Its wrath cannot be fled. No one can escape it. This is not invasion. This is not drought. This is authorized devastation, executed according to decree, targeting cities whose gods had already withdrawn. The texts insist the destruction was deliberate, coordinated, and final. Archaeological evidence confirms the textual record. Destruction layers appear across southern Mesopotamia, dated to approximately 2000 BC. Ur's population collapses. Uruk contracts to a fraction of its former size. Nippur shows evidence of burning and abandonment. Trade networks disintegrate. The Sumerian language begins its decline, replaced in administration and literature by Adian within generations. The texts do not explain why the council authorized this destruction. They do not identify what threat required such complete response. They simply document what happened. Gods departed, cities fell, and the land itself became uninhabitable for reasons the survivors could not fully articulate, but recorded nonetheless. What force followed the gods' departure? And why did it strike with precision sufficient to end Sumerian civilization while leaving neighboring regions intact? The phrase appears in multiple lamentation texts, always in the same context. Imhal, the evil wind. It is not described as natural weather. It does not follow seasonal patterns. The texts describe it as something released, directed, and devastatingly effective. The lament for Sumer and states, "The storm like a poisonous cloud covered the earth. On that day, the storm forced people into their houses. It did not let them go out. No one could walk through the city streets. Excavations across southern Mesopotamia reveal destruction layers dated to approximately 2000 BC. Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Eridu. These are not isolated incidents separated by decades. The archaeological record suggests synchronized collapse within a narrow time window. Walls show evidence of fire. Administrative buildings contain unfinished tablets as if work ceased suddenly. Storage areas hold grain that was never distributed. Residential quarters show signs of rapid abandonment. Personal items left behind. Doors left open. Evidence suggesting populations fled without organized evacuation. But the text describes something beyond military conquest or natural disaster. The lament for Nippur states, "The storm's tempest blowing wildly. Who can escape it? The storm that destroys cities, that destroys houses, that destroys stalls, that destroys sheepfolds, that makes the rivers flow with blood." Then comes a more disturbing detail. The fields produced no grain. The fisheries produced no fish. The gardens produced no honey or wine. The thick clouds did not rain. This is not temporary disruption. The text describes sustained agricultural collapse across regions that had supported dense urban populations for over 1,000 years. The lament for mentions land that turned into salt and fields where nothing grew for 3 years. The era epic, though from a later Babylonian context, contains similar language. Regions rendered barren, water sources contaminated, livestock that would not graze even when vegetation returned. Soil samples from archaeological sites in the region show evidence of unusual salinity levels in strata corresponding to this period, not from gradual irrigation-induced salinization, but appearing suddenly in the geological record. Climate data from proxy sources, tree rings, ice cores do not indicate drought or flood sufficient to explain the scale of agricultural failure the texts describe. The land itself, according to the lamentation literature, became hostile to life. The coordination troubles conventional explanations. If this were invasion, why would conquerors render the land they seized unusable? If drought, why the language of authorization and decree? If earthquake or volcanic event, why would texts insist the gods withdrew before destruction came? The pattern suggests something else. A deliberate systematic dismantling of the infrastructure, physical and divine, that had sustained Sumerian civilization. One detail stands apart from the rest. The lament for Suma includes a line that appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian literature. On that day, the Anunnaki turned their faces away. They hid their presence from the land. The place where they once dwelt became like the desert. The phrase hid their presence uses terminology elsewhere, applied to eclipse or obscuration, not departure, but concealment. As if what left was not just the gods, but something about the nature of reality they had maintained through their administration. By 1900, BC Sumerian language disappears from daily use. Scribes continue copying old texts, but new compositions shift to Adian. Political power consolidates in Babylon, far to the north. Southern cities persist, but never regain their former populations or influence. The archaeological record shows continuous habitation, but on drastically reduced scale. Villages where cities had stood, single temples where vast complexes had sprawled. The texts do not offer closure. They record what happened, list what was lost, and end with the same unresolved tension. Destruction came by divine decree, executed after the gods withdrew and left behind a world that could no longer sustain the civilization it had once nourished. After the Anunnaki vanished from direct governance, what world did humanity inherit? And what evidence remains of the transition from divine rule to human sovereignty alone? The Sumerian king list does not end with the catastrophe. It continues recording dynasties that ruled after 2000 BC, Ain Lassa, and eventually Babylon. But something fundamental changes in how kingship is described. Before the collapse, kings are depicted as chosen by gods ruling from temples where divine presence was maintained through daily ritual. After the collapse, kings rule from palaces. They claim divine sanction, but the texts no longer describe gods dwelling physically within their cities or issuing decrees through direct counsel. The shift is subtle but absolute. Hammurabi ruling Babylon around 1700 BC opens his famous law code by listing the gods who granted him authority. But he does not claim they walked among his administrators or convened in his throne room. The gods have become distant, invoked, honored, worshipped, but no longer present as they had been for the 2,000 years prior. The language changes. Early Sumerian texts use verbs of physical action. Gods descend, reside, depart. Later, Babylonian texts use verbs of abstraction. Gods bless, ordain, decree from heaven. The Sumerian language itself fades within 3 centuries of the catastrophe. By 1700 BC, it survives only in scribal schools and religious contexts. A liturgical tongue studied but not spoken. Adian, the Semitic language that had coexisted with Sumerian for over 1,000 years, becomes the administrative and literary standard across Mesopotamia. This is not conquest replacing a native language. Sumerian cities still stand. Sumerian temples still function. But the language that had recorded divine governance, that had been used for contracts between gods and humans, that had structured the earliest law codes, vanishes from daily life, as if the framework it described no longer applied. Cuneiform tablets from the post-sea catastrophe period show scribes laboriously copying ancient Sumerian texts, myths, hymns, king lists, creation accounts. They add glosses in Adian explaining terms that had become obscure. They preserve the literature, but not the context that produced it. These later scribes are archivists, not witnesses. They inherit records of a world they did not experience and cannot fully reconstruct. Mythology in the conventional sense begins here. Stories that earlier texts presented as administrative history become religious narrative. The Anunnaki, once described as territorial governors with specific jurisdictions, become abstract deities associated with cosmic forces rather than city management. Enki transitions from administrator of Erodu's water systems to god of wisdom and magic. Enlil shifts from council authority, who issued decrees, to storm god whose anger explains natural disaster. The beings who once required grain offerings and labor assignments become symbols invoked in prayer. But the earlier texts remain. They sit in museum storage, copied and recopied by scribes who treated them not as fantasy, but as records worth preserving across centuries of political upheaval. The Atrahasis epic describes humanity's creation as a labor solution. The flood narratives describe population control and internal descent. The lamentation texts describe coordinated destruction following divine withdrawal. And the king list records impossibly long reigns before the flood, transitioning to human-scale lifespans afterward, without ever acknowledging the transition as mythological. Here is what the texts preserve. A system of governance that operated for millennia, encountered internal crisis it could not resolve through existing mechanisms, fractured into competing authorities, and ended in coordinated collapse that destroyed the civilization it had created. Whether that system was divine in the literal sense the Sumerians claimed, or whether their records preserve something else, a ruling class they understood as fundamentally different from themselves, cannot be determined from the tablets alone. What remains certain is this: the Sumerians treated their history as continuous. They did not distinguish between mythological time and historical time. Their chronologies run without interruption from the moment kingship descended from heaven, through the flood, through the third dynasty, through the catastrophe that ended their language and their city's dominance. They recorded reign lengths, construction projects, wars, famines, and divine decisions in the same bureaucratic script used for warehouse inventories. Modern scholarship reads this as mythology framed in historical language, religious texts borrowing the authority of administrative documents. But the Sumerians themselves offer no such framing. They do not mark any boundary where history becomes myth. They simply record in sequential order what their predecessors recorded before them, preserving a narrative that begins with God's ruling directly and ends with God's withdrawing permanently after authorizing devastation. Their human subjects could not prevent or survive intact. The archaeological record supports fragments of this narrative. Cities did emerge suddenly. They did operate through temple-centered administration for over 2,000 years. They did collapse synchronously around 2000 BC. Agriculture did fail across regions previously fertile. The Sumerian language did vanish from common use within centuries, and no subsequent Mesopotamian civilization, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, ever claimed their gods ruled as physical administrators of daily governance the way the earliest Sumerian texts describe. Something ended around 2000 BC. Whether it was divine administration, an unrecorded ruling class, or a political system later generations mythologized, the texts themselves insist it was final. The gods left, the land failed, the language disappeared, and humanity continued, ruling cities the Anunnaki had once governed, without the presence that had structured civilization since Eridu's first temple was built in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia. The lamentation texts do not explain why this happened. They document what happened and preserve the emotional weight of watching a world end. Not through external invasion, not through natural disaster, but through internal collapse authorized by the very system that had maintained order for millennia. The scribes who copied these texts centuries later did not soften the narrative. They preserved it intact, perhaps believing future generations needed to understand what happens when governing authority fractures beyond repair. If the Sumerians recorded the end of divine rule once, preserving that memory through generations of scribes who maintained the account without embellishment or explanation, were they simply documenting their trauma? Or warning those who came after what happens when power collapses from within, when councils fracture, when territorial disputes escalate beyond resolution, and when those who governed choose to withdraw rather than continue, the tablets remain. The cities they describe lie in excavated ruins, and the question they pose has never been definitively answered. Were these myths created to explain catastrophe, or records of catastrophe preserved as warning?